Good. My name is Sean Wildermuth. We're going to be talking about Eclipse in our long 20-minute session here. So I hope all of you brought your smartest questions. One of the problems that I see out there, and I run a training company, so we train a lot of Silverlight developers. And when Silverlight developers are coming from a purely Microsoft space, it isn't a hard decision to make to use Silverlight. They're already comfortable with the tool set. They're already comfortable with the language choices they've made. But when you come into Silverlight from a different back-end perspective, one of the important pieces around Silverlight for me is the idea that it's purely client-side, that what I have on the back end shouldn't matter. Shouldn't matter if I'm running PHP or JSP or Ruby on Rails or old CGI code running on an Amiga DOS computer, right? It shouldn't matter what's on the back end. And so when we try to bring these two different worlds in, we have a tool problem. That tool problem is purely that the one side of the room wants to do things in a certain way and the other want to do it in a different way. And bringing things like Visual Studio into a Java shop, for instance, is a very difficult proposition. That's really where Eclipse comes in. There's an Eclipse plugin to support developing Silverlight applications directly in Eclipse. So let's actually see it working. Let's give you the good news first. So this is this is Eclipse running in a Java perspective. So I could come in here and create a JSP project, but because I've installed the Silverlight plugin, I can do the very familiar, get that out of the way, file new project, filter it into Silverlight, and start a Silverlight web project, just like I can in Visual Studio. My first Silverlight has a Silverlight perspective associated with it, so we'll go ahead and switch it over, though it's not required to be in this. Really, it's just how the page is set up. And we're actually getting some pretty good facility here. We get a preview. We're getting a XAML editor. And the preview is actually correct. It's just, as with most demos, a white background of a Silverlight app isn't all that interesting. So let's make a couple of changes. Make this light gray. I would make the text bigger, but honestly, I'm not positive how in Eclipse. But you'll be able to get these demos afterwards. What I'm typing is much less important than the rest of what you're seeing here. So I'm just going to write a quick ellipse. And if you wait long enough, which I'm not, it will also give you decent IntelliSense. So I'll go ahead and just say green here. And in fact, we can execute the project it created. Because interestingly, is it actually created a ASP.NET project associated with it as well. So let me just view this. Make the saves. There's no real build step because build happens every time you save. Ooh, we get our Silverlight project. We're running it in Eclipse. But what we see so far isn't all that interesting because we're dealing with, see if I have Zoom installed. Nope. We're dealing with Silverlight project with an ASP.NET backend. So who cares? Does that make sense to everybody? The real magic is, let me go ahead and change to my Martha Stewart example and pull it out of the oven. A pre-built Eclipse example. So in a lot of the customers I'm going to, they already have investments made in other technologies, whether that's in Java, PHP, Ruby on Rails, whatever it would be. They're dealing with another back-end technology they want to integrate with. And let's go to a Java perspective. So I can see that I have some test servers running off Tomcat. I've got a website with some web content. I've got a index.jsp and run this on the server. Move your mouse clockwise to make it go faster. So here we're actually seeing a Silverlight app on a JSP page. Now, this shouldn't come as any surprise to most Silverlight developers, because all we're doing is hosting this using an object tag. What we're doing isn't all that interesting here. The important part is where it fits in with people's development scheme. The fact that Eclipse can do this isn't rocket science. In fact, announced today, which we'll talk about a little bit more, was the fact that we could do this on Mac as well. What the open source plugin is doing here is really leveraging the back end. There's a lot that's required to make this actually work. Let's pop back over to the slide so we can kind of talk through some of the experiences here. So if you have an investment already in some of these technologies, or really any technology inside of Eclipse, and you want to bring that forward, you want to marry it together with a Silverlight experience, this is a good story. Because the experience otherwise is using two IDEs. And getting a developer to become good in one IDE is a challenge in most cases. Getting them to be good in two IDEs is a bigger challenge. Especially when you're dealing with Eclipse and Visual Studio being so different from each other in a lot of the way they just think about the development process. To get this working, you need Eclipse. You need the JDK 1.5 or above, and you need the JDK because that's what Eclipse runs on. You need a version of Eclipse. The version for enterprise development, Java EE development, is the one that's preferred, but it will work with Eclipse Basic. Though the story becomes less interesting with Basic, because if you're only developing Silverlight applications against HTML, Visual Studio is often a better story. Requires the .NET framework on the box, requires the Silverlight 2 runtime, and requires the SDK. Does not require Visual Studio. That's an important note here. It's also recommended that you include a couple of other pieces. Let's pop over back to Eclipse so we can talk about actually, let me go one more slide, then we'll do that. So installing the plugin, if you're not that familiar with Eclipse, it uses the plugin software updater model. So you actually go into Eclipse. I always forget where this is. There, the software updates. As you actually add this in from the Eclipse for sl.org update URI. And this is how you actually install the plugin. It actually pulls binaries, and this is if I had a internet connection, but let's just pretend I did. It would show the pieces of the project that it's going to pull down, and it pulls them down directly from SourceForge so that you can actually look at the code that it's generating. Some limitations. Now, this first limitation has primarily gone away, but if you want to talk about maturity, the version that they have for Mac today is really a tech preview. So a number of things that are supposed to not work, and it's a very early attempt at it. So I'm not sure that I would bet my next software project on it quite yet. Maybe in a couple of months, but right now it's pretty early. Works pretty well on Windows. It does require the SDK and uses MS Build currently. Now on the Mac, the story is a bit different in that it doesn't require MS Build. But the MS Build story is important here because all the current plugin is doing is executing the CS proj or the VB proj into MS Build. It's doing the same sort of build that Visual Studio is doing. Now, this is a benefit on the Windows boxes because that means that we can get all the facilities of Visual Studio. So everything that the project can do on the Visual Studio side will execute correctly. The problem is there is no way to look at our Silverlight project and look at things like service references, post and build commands, other preferences. A lot of that isn't exposed here. And so what you end up doing in that case is opening it up in Visual Studio. because it's using the same project files, if I can type today, here I could go ahead and add a service reference and then use it, but there's no way within Eclipse to do this sort of work. I can't look at pre and post builds either. So if I wanted to handle build events, I couldn't do it directly in the tool. No, I could if I didn't have Visual Studio installed. I could use the command line tools to build the service references. I could muck with the CSproj XML file to get most of this functionality. But that's not a very friendly story. At this point in the world of Silverlight integration, we're talking about good enough, not good. So it's good enough to get that integration, but in most cases, I'm going to see, at least in the Windows world, that you're going to have both installed, Visual Studio and Eclipse. You may do most of your work in Eclipse, but you may come back to Visual Studio to get some of the features that you're going to need. Service references being probably the most painful of those, but of course you could do that as a build step and execute against the service reference builder, the actual SL servref builder, to go ahead and create that. The other piece is inside of Eclipse to do some of the work that you might expect to do in post and pre-build. You're going to end up creating builders. So here I have builders, and I've built a copy output builder, which is essentially just calling X copy to go ahead and put my ZAP file in the right place in my web project. There's no notion of relating it to a Java project or a PHP or Ruby on Rails. I'm going to have to know where it's going to end up in that build cycle. The build cycle in Eclipse is different enough. Normally it's on a build on change method, and so this builder ends up recopying this over and over and over again. And so handling that situation is something as a developer you're going to need to be keenly aware of. So another thing is that the preview ignores control templates. This is an important thing if you're expecting the preview to be an accurate representation of your XAML. Again, to pop over to our Eclipse. This looks fine, but our convert button actually, when we run it, tell it to run again. You can see we actually have a control template in there that we're running. In the preview, we don't get any of that because it's only using the raw in-page XAML. It's not using any of the control templating at all. So if you have a very skinned application, you're going to see something very different in the preview than you are going to see in the actual application. And no debugging support. This is, to me, a pretty big one. I can't run as and set breakpoints in managed code in Eclipse. It means we're settled to debug right, pop-up alert windows. We're back to the old days of development again. For the purely integration step, it's still a significant milestone in that you could have developers that are the consumers of a Silverlight app be part of that, bring it in and bring it into the JSP page project, make it just work. Maybe they don't have to do a lot of development on the Silverlight side, but you want to have it part of that project so their pages look fine. And that's good enough. But we're not going to get to the point where they're giving a great story. The last piece I'll mention is you can go out there today on the Mac, point at this software update location, which is Eclipse for sl.org, update Mac, and they do have it working on the Mac. Some of the details on how they're getting it working, because they haven't actually let me know before it was released today to play with the bits. I don't know how they're doing things like the MS build integration. The XAML representation is pretty easy, but it's really that build integration. I'm not sure what they're using. There was talk of them using Mono's build system on Mac instead of using MS build, but I don't know that they've had time to do that. I'll take questions in a second so we can get them on the microphone. Sorry. We're almost done. The other features that are coming in the next release, which will include the Mac features, are better interoperability with Java, more media features so that you can bring in the richer media styles even on the Mac, on the Mac, cross-platform, of course, and actual documentation. Today, the documentation is fiercely thin. There's some blog posts that give you walkthroughs and a couple of videos, but there's no real user documentation today. I'll open it up now to questions. We have about 4.5 minutes. If you have a question, if you can go to the microphone so they can get this all on tape.
Hi. You mentioned a bunch of limitations for the Windows version of the Eclipse. Are these limitations the same on the Mac end, or?
They should be identical limitations. The question was whether the Mac limitation, same limitations in the Mac, and absolutely. One of the problems on the Mac side right now is there is also no rich designer. So there isn't Blend for the Mac or something like it, though I know the amount of people are working on something that might be able to help in that space.
Nice job, Scott, on the presentation. My name is Vijay. I'm one of the architect and sponsor for this project. This is funded by Microsoft, developed by Soyatech. I'll answer that particular question. The Windows limitation, is it true on Mac as well? First and foremost, this is an evolving, ongoing open source project, so many of the limitations will be addressed in the upcoming milestones in Windows. Yes, some of the debugging limitations that you see in Windows are limitations in Mac as well. In the forthcoming milestone, we are going to solve the better debugging capabilities and some of the limitations in Windows. Again, on the build system capabilities that you were addressing, we were using Mono framework on the Mac instead of, you were right on that part.
Oh, good. Are you going to have one build system so it does the same on PC? So,
well, I think it's a little complicated. We have really nicely integrated with MS Build on the Windows, using its extensibility model. On Mac, since we didn't have that
Sure.
opportunity, we were using Mono framework.
Great. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming. We're going to end a couple minutes short then, and I'll be up here if you have questions and you're too afraid to go to the microphone. And thanks for coming. Oh, I promised them that I would tell you to fill out your eval forms, please. I think there's a prize, or they get to call me back next year or something. I don't know what it is. But if you're confused about it, just the higher score is what you should put if you're not sure what to put for the scores. Thank you.